The bombings do work. The bombings are working. They know what they're doing. Just because you don't know what they're doing doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing. Of course they know what they're doing. The bombings are achieving what they're supposed to, which is to destroy Yugoslavia, to turn it into a deindustrialized, beggar-poor nation of cheap labor, completely defensive to the interests of capital investors. This is a batterer's policy. The batterer is not irrational. The batterer uses violence against his helpless spouse. He uses just a certain amount of level to get a certain response and batters that person down and batters the person down. And that's what this is. It's a battering policy to destroy and smash them down, but smash them and splinter them so badly that they will never rise again and never come back again, even as a viable bourgeois nation, let alone socialist. The old arguments we hear with regard to Vietnam are coming back. Well, we can't just pull out. Oh, yes, we can. We can. We can do it with 2 words. You can pull out with just 2 words. It's called ceasefire. And then another 2 words, NATO disband. And yes, we, the real we really do have to do something. Call the White House, call your Congress people, your media, talk back, demonstrate, organize, agitate, educate yourself and others. Let them know how you feel. Don't think they're not interested, my friends. Oh man, are they interested in that? Oh man, do you think they are not watching you all the time? Why do you think guys like me are under surveillance? I mean, I'm not kidding you. When I pick up the phone rings and I pick it up and someone starts talking to me, mimicking in a mocking tone a conversation I just had on the phone 2 hours ago with someone else, then you're moving from surveillance to harassment. But they let me know that I'm under surveillance. But it's not just people who are super active and all. They want to know what the general public is thinking. They never stop thinking about you. When you say, oh, they don't care what we're thinking. Oh, no, they always focus on you because they know they're standing on your shoulders. And if this great mass began to shrug and rumble and all that sort of thing, it gets very wobbly up there. So against the lies... Against the lies and the homicidal violence of this national security aberration, the thin, frail voice of reason and democracy can become a mighty chorus and a strong resistance. I have seen it happen before, and we can make it happen again. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. He was asked, do you have freedom of the press? He said, no, we don't really. You're not free in Cuba to preach capitalism, racism, sexism, or imperialism, or those things. We do have a controlled press. Why don't you have our capitalist point of view in here in Cuba? He said, well, we get all your stations from Miami anyway, but we'll be happy to put your viewpoint on our official television when you would make time and put our viewpoint on your television. Oh, well, we can't do that because we have a free and independent press. Right. Okay. So we are told that we must oppose Cuba because Fidel Castro is a dictator. But wait a minute. Before Fidel Castro took power in 1959, there had been 20 years of rule by a dictator. His name was Batista. Batista was a butcher. He was hated by the Cuban people. And the U.S. loved him, kissed him, hugged him, made nice with him, sent him aid, trained his Guardia Civile and all this sort of thing. What's the difference? What was the difference between Batista and Castro? The difference was that Batista was a cooperative dictator. What does that mean? It means that he opened up his country to U.S. interests. He says, come on in, boys. The tobacco industry here, the best in the world, right? Cuban tobacco, Cuban cigar. It's yours. The cotton industry, the sugar industry, the magnesium, the mining, the shell food, the tourist industry, big one, all yours. You guys come on in. You own it all, Yankees. You can have it. You can profit. And I keep my people down so that they work hard for less. And the less you have to pay them, the more there is for you. And all you got to do, though, is take care of me, my family, my brother Juan, my brother Jose, my cousin this and that. You give me my boodle. You train my police and paramilitary, and we'll take care of everything for you. And so it was a client-state relationship. So what you had was U.S. tax money going in there to make the world safe, to make Cuba safe for big U.S. investments.
Regarding the Soviet Union, here was a nation that threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast and sustained 80% of the Allied losses in the war, 22 million dead. I thought that that was a debt that humanity owed the Soviet people. Here was a nation that in 3 decades made industrial advances equal to what it took capitalism a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling its children rather than working them 14 hours a day, as the capitalists did during the Industrial Revolution, and as capitalists are still doing today in many parts of the world. Here was a nation that provided vital assistance, material, military, medical, armed assistance to liberation movements in Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, South Africa, Angola, and other countries. As Nelson Mandela pointed out, I heard him on a TV show in Washington when he was visiting here in 1990. And the announcer, of course, was doing his usual thing. He said, well, the U.S. has done this and the Soviets have done that, so we know both of them. He's doing the balancing act. You have to always do that. Dumping on both of them. Said, what do you say, Mr. Mandela? And Mandela said, please do not denounce the Soviet Union. They have been our great friends and given us valuable aid in the struggle against apartheid and racism. Only Mandela could get away with saying that on national TV. Here was one of the few countries that, for all its injustices and dysfunctional structures, and I am going to talk about those things, be patient, did guarantee its citizens some minimal economic security. Here was another positive thing that's never mentioned, a country that performed the rescue and survival of 3 million Soviet Jews during World War II. I mean, many Jews were killed in World War II because many Russians were, period, because they were just in the war and fighting. But 3 million Soviet Jewish civilians were saved, which is more than you can say happened to Jews in Poland and most of Eastern Europe, in Germany and Croatia.
Now, whenever you ascribe conscious intent and pursuit of self-interest at the top, you will hear someone say, well, what are you, a conspiracy theorist? You can say farmers consciously organized to pursue their interests, and everybody will say, the farmers are organized. You can say machinists or auto workers are organizing, and everybody says, they're consciously organizing and pursuing, or school teachers or other people. But if you say that the people who own most of America and most of the world, if you say they consciously organize and pursue things to get what they want, then you hear people saying, oh, you have a conspiracy theory? You think they really do that? The alternative to a conspiracy theory is an innocence theory. That is, they do all this stuff, but they're not pursuing self-interest. They just do it, you know. The other alternative is a somnambulist theory. Somnambulism is the tendency to walk in your sleep. David Rockefeller gets up in the morning and he says, what am I going to do to advance my interests and protect my interests? No, that would be conspiratorial. Hey, well, that stuff happens, whatever, that's okay. Another alternative would be coincidence theory. It's just a coincidence that this happened. Or sometimes a variation of coincidence theory is uncanny theory. Then there's stupidity theory and incompetence theory. Don't laugh at that one. That's used all the time. I have had about a 20-year argument with my co-politicists on the left to stop calling Ronald Reagan stupid, to stop calling George Bush stupid. It's good for a joke or something, but that guy knew what he was doing, and he did it. He got rid of the inheritance tax for the super rich. He cut corporate taxes down to almost nothing. He doubled the military budget. He waged 2 major wars and got this country into war and left it that way. He deregulated, well, actually another creep before him named Bill Clinton deregulated the banking system and all that to create this disaster that we've been facing. These guys know what they're doing, and they know who they're doing it for. They're doing it for themselves.
Now, this red menace that's propagated by the military, industrial, governmental, and media complex, that's what I call it, serves the function of telling people that it's worse anywhere else. One of the first things you will hear is, where is it any better? The Soviets have it worse. If you go around and lecture, I'm dealing with the subject right now, but generally I might talk about Reaganomics. Talk about any subject. Almost the first question you get is, talk about the Russians. What about them? It's worse there. It's worse there. So why criticize here? And you could say, maybe it is worse there. And by the way, I don't think that the evidence indicates that in terms of economic conditions. Maybe it is worse there. What the hell's that got to do with you here? I mean, if you had abuses and problems here at University of Massachusetts, would someone get up and say, it's worse at the University of New Hampshire? which it probably is. But what are you supposed to say to that? You're supposed to go, oh, that's okay then. Oh, then let them double my tuition because they're tripling it in New Hampshire. Oh, that's all right. Oh, then we shouldn't complain. Oh, that's worse. But that's the first, I tell you, man, you can go anywhere in the country now. That's the first question that'll come up. Where do you think it's any better? Now, I think it's better in Cuba, where I injured my leg, a very serious injury, my Achilles tendon, and I went to a hospital and I got an operation, and nobody gave me that examination you get in the US, the first examination you get when you go into an emergency clinic and you can be bleeding from 3 places, the examination of your wallet to see if you got medical coverage, and if you don't, you're sent to another hospital, you're dumped on the public hospital, which may be across town while you're still bleeding. It was better in Cuba where I got that operation, and I didn't have to pay a penny, and I came back here with a cast, and I tried to get an orthopedic doctor, and I couldn't, and I could pay. I said, I'll pay, you don't understand, I'll pay. And they said, oh, we know you'll pay, we don't take any other kind of patient. But they're all booked, and I finally got some guy who just came out of medical school, and I hobbled into his office, and he looked at the cast, and he said, leave it on another week, that's $50. I can tell you that $50, I never resented paying $50 so much. It was better in Cuba. In a poor country, I got good medical care. In a rich country, I'm treated like a beggar and a pariah. It was better in Cuba, where I didn't see any kids with swollen bellies and hungry and begging. I didn't see any people begging. It was better in Cuba than it was in Washington, D.C., where I live, and I walk down the street and I see people in total misery and disorientation standing there begging for food, begging for money, sleeping in hallways. I see that in the richest country in the world. That's where it was better. And when you talk about freedom, that's freedom. And when you talk about oppression, that's oppression. Sleeping in a doorway is oppression. You want to know what oppression is? Then sleep in the doorways of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and you'll know what oppression is. You want to know what oppression is? Then think about the guys who sit there wondering if they're going to blow their brains out because they can't pay the mortgage on their house and they can't feed their kids and they see the whole thing falling apart. That's where it's better. And those are real things, and that's part of freedom. Now, the military, no, you don't have to. The Red Menace that's propaganda, though, tries to direct popular discontent. Don't think you got it bad because it's worse over there, you see. And also, there's a menace out there. And don't make too much waves here. We are in very serious times. What does Reagan do in his 6 years? What has he been doing? He has been distracting people from the real issues of their lives. He has refused to talk about human services, about underemployment, about the crises of the cities, except occasionally to make a little quip, like the other night where he talked about some guy who was living in a $36,000 rental in a welfare hotel. And saying, that sounds pretty good to me, not pointing out that the price was a ripoff on the government, which he should have been looking at, and the guy was living in a cramped, crowded, dirty little room in that hotel because no one else would take him anywhere else. And for all those years, what has he been doing? He's been telling you about Gaddafi, and terrorism, and the Soviet menace, and the evil empire, and our defenses, and this and that, and out there and over there. Rally around the flag, forget the realities of your own life. And this is what the ruling elites have to do. They have to continually, strenuously bring us back to the fantasies of their world, because the people keep floating off into reality. And that's a problem for them. The people keep floating off, concerned about jobs and homes and the education of their kids and their medical bills and that sort of thing. And so that's what he's been doing. And that Red Menace is very important for that function. It is very functional. Went to the Western powers and called for an alliance with England, the United States, and France against Nazi Germany. And that if the Germans attacked Czechoslovakia, they would all join in, or attack Poland, or attack anybody, that all the powers would join in to fight Hitler and contain him. The Western allies refused those overtures from the Soviet Union. Not because they were appeasers, not because they were simple and naive, quite the contrary, because they had a plan of their own, and that plan was Munich. And the plan was, we give Hitler Czechoslovakia and he goes east.
And they were waiting for a war. And that war was supposed to come. And it was going to be Nazi Germany finishing off Bolshevik Russia. Just as they had sent armies in against Russia just a few years less than a decade before, so they now plan to do the same. And so they've done again and again. And that war was fought, and most of it was fought on the Eastern Front. 7 out of every 10 German soldiers who died in that war died on the Eastern Front. The scale of fighting was enormous. The battles of Kursk, Stalingrad, the Battle of Berlin. There's nothing like it that happened in the Western Theater, in the Western Front. In the Battle of Berlin, you saw 2 million German soldiers against 3.5 million attacking Soviet soldiers. The losses were stupendous. But at the end of that war, the Soviet Union emerged as a major power. Very weakened, very much weakened, having lost most of its industries west of the Urals, having lost 20 million people. Most of its transportation, by the way, at that time was still by horse or oxen in most areas for most of its population. But it still had the Red Army. And yet it was not an army that had any intention of marching through Europe. Although that was a NATO myth that was cultivated at the time. And there's an interesting set of documents that just came out in the American Historical Review, which point out now that the West and the State Department never really believed that the Soviets were going to invade Western Europe. That was a myth which they consciously propagated. They knew that after an exhausting war, the last thing the Russian people would ever go for, or the Russian leaders themselves would ever go for, was another war. There was no sense, they had no interest in such a war. The war they fought against Germany was defensive, and they wanted to rebuild their country. That was a myth that was consciously propagated, that if we don't stop them, if we don't build NATO, if we don't double, triple, quadruple our defense forces, the Ruskies will be marching under the Arc de Triomphe. The point of all of what I've said so far is just to point out to you that the Cold War did not begin in 1947, but it began in 1917.
That government was doing what the United States leaders will not tolerate anywhere. They will not tolerate any government in the world that is attempting an alternative system outside of the globalization process, outside of that system of U.S. multinational, transnational, global finance capitalism. Outside, even another capitalist country that's trying economic nationalism and developing itself on its own terms, even that will no longer be tolerated. That was tolerated. When there was a Soviet Union, that was tolerated. When there was a Soviet Union, Yugoslavia was tolerated. It was a country that was a buffer against the Soviets. It was independent of the Soviets, often critical of them, but it also was socialist. With the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the ruling interests in Western capitalism have come to certain realizations. We don't have to make any kind of social contract with our own working class anymore. We don't have to turn to you and say, you see how much better you live than the people over in Russia? We don't have to say that anymore. We won. We're rolling back in Russia. In fact, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, there was a very querulous note that began to appear in many right-wing publications. It went as follows. If now in the former communist countries we're having total free market deregulation and takeover and privatization, why must we still tolerate here in our own countries, why must we still tolerate social programs and public ownership and regulation and the like? We don't have to tolerate that anymore. And you workers, you can forget about lifelong seniority or job security, whatever else. You got nowhere else to go. You can go turn any color you want, red, pink, whatever else, but there's no Soviet menace anymore there. You don't have a base. You don't have a global base anymore. And they could turn to the third world countries that they were giving aid to and saying, we're going to build you up and build a prosperous middle class and make you a little bit more like Western Europe or North America so that you will not be tempted to go communist, and which means go socialist. Want to keep you capitalist, but a kind of a capitalism with a human face. Well, capitalism with a human face is now capitalism in your face. And they don't have to do that anymore.
Are you Marxist?
I said
And this is my answer. I would wear that label proudly if I knew that you understood what I meant by Marxist. And when somebody like Reed Irvine says, you're a Marxist, aren't you? Whose only intention is to give a buzzword which says this guy drinks the blood of capitalist children or something, then I'm going to say, no, I'm not your label. I don't particularly want your label. That was why I deferred from the label Marxist. And you see, there's something about saying Marxist when I write a book about the media. And you remember the point I made. I said, look, I wrote the book about the media. I don't know what Karl Marx has to say about 20th century U.S. media. I think he had very little to say because, he left early. But there's been a lot of creative thought and scholarship in Marxist literature and whatever else, and I feel that it's like a scholasticist thing. Oh, you took your formula and you applied it here. I don't see these things that way because I'm a Marxist. It's the opposite. I started seeing these things, and then I began realizing that there was an analysis that had explanatory power for that. It gets very frustrating. For years I'd knock myself out trying to make an analysis. I'd come to the conclusion, I'd say, hey, the police are not neutral. They're on the side of property and power. And somebody would say to me, that's a Marxist term. You sound like a Marxist. It's a Marxist. Oh. And then I said, hey, wealth is largely unaccountable in many of the things it does in our democracy. I don't understand. That isn't what I learned. So that's a Marxist point of view. That's Marx said that, And it would go on, one thing after another. Every time I said, boy, this Karl Marx was really something, Every time I put two and two together and come up with a good analysis, they give him the credit for it.
Left anti-communism was, and it still is, as orthodox and dogmatic as the mainstream or the more extreme McCarthyite varieties, in that it doesn't tolerate anything positive being uttered about existing communist systems, except possibly Cuba. For some reason, and the Cuban system is exactly the Soviet system. One party, women's federations, the role of trade union movement, the role of youth groups, is exactly the same model. But Cuba is kind of looked at warmly, which is nice. I guess we'd be grateful for small things. Left anti-communism expects nothing less than a blanket condemnation of communist countries as Stalinist monstrosities, historic and moral aberrations. I prefer what psychologists call differential object appraisal. That you look at something and you see it in very differentiated things. Some things good, some things not so good. Regardless of what the political orthodoxy is, regardless of what the advice is about maintaining your credibility, and so making sure that you say these other things. In reaction to this anti-Sovietism, anti-communism, many communists overcompensated by going to the other extreme, by refraining from uttering or even tolerating, listening to a critical word about the autocratic or problematic features of the Soviet Union. Problem-ridden features. I got into more than one altercation trying to make a criticism of the Soviet system with friends and acquaintances in the Communist Party. I can recall a friend of mine, a party member here in the U.S., who assured me that there was no prostitution in the Soviet Union. Here was a woman, she was in her mid-40s, a grown woman of some experience, saying to me that in this nation of, 300 million people, there was no prostitution. I couldn't believe it. I remember when I was in the Soviet Union in Moscow, the guide saying to me, there was no prostitution in my country. Another grown, mature woman. And I said to her, there may be no prostitution in your country, but there's a hell of a lot of it here in this hotel. Let's get real. Come on, let's get real. We're talking about this very messy, imperfect thing called a human being. And the social organizations they developed were even more messy and imperfect than they. Well, you know what her response was? She said, without batting an eye, she said, well, those women also have regular jobs during the day, I would like to know. Thereby giving new meaning to the term working girl. Some say that the upheavals in Eastern Europe don't constitute a defeat for socialism because socialism never existed in those countries. What you had there was state capitalism, some such thing. Well, whether we want to call them socialist or not is a matter of definition. Suffice it to say that they constituted something different from what existed in the profit-driven capitalist world, as the capitalists themselves were quick and persistent to recognize. First, the productive forces in these countries were not organized for capital gain and private enrichment, as with capitalism. Public ownership supplanted private ownership. The perks that were enjoyed by party and government elites were relatively modest compared to the elites in most civilizations. Yes, it's true, Soviet leaders like Yuri Andropov and Brezhnev had big dachas where they entertained foreign visitors. Yes, it's true they had limousine services and they lived in fairly large apartments in a housing project specially set aside for government leaders near the Kremlin. I saw it. It's a big, ugly, old, very inauspicious building. That's where the leaders of the Soviet Union lived. But it was larger than what ordinary Soviets would get. But nobody in the Soviet Union could hire the labor of others and extract great personal wealth from that labor. The degree of inherited wealth was also relatively modest and limited. The income spread between highest and lowest earners in the Soviet Union was about 3 or 4 to 1. That's compared to 40 or 50 to 1 in the U.S. In fact, I did a little computation. If you compare Steve Forbes, multi-billionaire Steve Forbes' income to a poverty-level wage earner, the spread is more like 10,000 to 1, 10,000 times to 1. Furthermore, communist countries did not pursue the capital penetration of other countries. They didn't have a profit motive as their motive force. They didn't have a need to constantly find new investment opportunities to be able to invest more, to accumulate more, to invest more abroad as under capitalism. The Soviet Union's trade and aid relations were generally economically favorable to Eastern European nations, Cuba, and India. A real socialism, it's argued, would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation instead of being run by Leninists, Stalinists, Castroites, or other ill-willed, evil leaders and bureaucrats who betray revolutions, we hear. Well, unfortunately, this pure socialism view is profoundly ahistorical and non-falsifiable. By that I mean it remains untestable against the actualities of history. It compares an ideal against an imperfect reality, and sure enough, reality comes off a poor second. The pure socialist ideological anticipations remain untainted by existing practice. They don't explain how a complex revolutionary society could be built and secured, how priorities could be set, how survival could be achieved by just having the workers own and control everything. How do you expropriate enough surplus value to build an army to defend yourself against the invasion that comes? It's no surprise that the pure socialists support every revolution except the ones that succeed. The pure socialists usually blame the left for every defeat by the left. They weren't vigorous enough, they weren't resourceful enough, they didn't mobilize people enough, they didn't do this enough, they didn't do that enough, they didn't do this enough. They presume to know better than those engaged in the actual struggles. And it's unfortunate that they haven't found time to apply their own brilliant insights and leadership genius to producing a successful mass revolutionary movement in our own country.
Unemployment went down in Chile. Inflation was going down. The rate of inflation was going down. Buying power was increasing for the ordinary people. Popular consumption was increasing. The level of living was bettering in a modest way for the people. Every child in Chile was getting a half a liter of milk under the Allende regime. And when the fascist Pinochet came in, that was one of the first programs he abolished. And in Guatemala, in Arbenz, when he came into office, he legalized all opposition parties. He legalized all opposition, all trade unions, all opposition newspapers, all student organizations, which were very political in Guatemala at the time. And then he began to expropriate the unused land from the United Fruit Company. And that's when the CIA went in with a mercenary army, trained by and equipped and financed by the CIA, and overthrew him. It wasn't that he threatened democracy, it's that he was using democracy, he was using political democracy to effectuate an economic democracy. And that economic democracy is the thing that privileged classes have hated all their lives. If you go back to ancient Greece, if you look at our founding fathers and the debates at the Constitutional Convention, they talk about the leveling impulse, the common people wanting a bigger share of what we have. And they don't want to give up what they have. They don't want to give it up. They'll fight and kill to keep it. No more than you want to give up your little car or your house or whatever little you got. You don't want to give it up. Imagine if you didn't just own a little car. Imagine if you owned the world. Imagine if you owned everything there was to own. Imagine if you lived like a king. Imagine if you lived in a way that the whole society was there for your service, in a sense. To give that up is the worst tyranny of life. And much of what is called freedom has that class anchorage in it. You can talk to those people who are displaced from revolutionary countries, and they will tell you of the horror of socialism, the horror of revolution. They'll tell you how this Committee for the Defense of Revolution comes in and says, you have 5 houses, you have to give up 4 of those houses now because we have people who are homeless and they're going to live in those houses. Can you imagine that? That my houses, the houses that have been in my family for 3 generations, that were given to us by my grandfather, Generalissimo Thug, are going to be taken now? And he says, you have 12 servants, we have a labor shortage, you can only keep the 2 oldest ones, and the other 10 must go out on the labor market because we need them for work. Can you imagine they tell me, my servants that are like my children, they're part of my family, I love them, they love me, Ave Maria, they're going to take my servants away from me? You call that freedom? Tyranny. And they tell me I have to double the wages of my workers. Who are they to tell me how much I pay my workers? I decide that. I decide that. I mean, the rage about this. And when my senora and I want to go on our shopping trips, as we do every year, to Paris and London and Miami, they say, no, you can't take any currency out of the country. You call that being free? They tell you can't travel anymore? And then they give me a ration book. And I get online with my Mercedes. I have to get online for 5 gallons of gasoline. Where could you even go for 5 gallons of gasoline? And in front of me is this little truck with chickens all over it and the dirt and the feathers all over. I have to wash my car again after I'm on that ration line. I mean, it's disgusting. You call that being free? You call that being alive? And so finally, what do we do, my senora and I? We give it all up. We're so disgusted with it. And we move to Miami, where we can be free. And our picture is taken in the Miami Herald. And we see freedom finally, freedom to choose. Kmart, Bloomingdale's, freedom of a wide spectrum of opinion now. NBC, ABC, CBS, enormously wide, diverse media opinion, different perspectives, different viewpoints, different ideological points, all sorts of unusual information and depth of analysis, right? Now that was being ironic, right? And they say they're free. And the Miami Herald is a picture of them burning their ration card. But that ration card for the campesino in that country, that ration card is an important democratic victory. That's democracy that's won. With that ration card, the demos, the ordinary people in that country, have now got some guarantees. With that ration card, it means he's never going to hear his kids crying of hunger again, because he knows rationing like nobody else. Because he had the other rationing, the earlier rationing, the rationing of the free market. When your kids cried, when if you didn't have the money, you were rationed, that's all. You don't think for a minute you're not rationed. You're rationed every day. You ration yourself every day. If you don't think so, just stop and listen to yourself saying it. What'll I do? Should I spend that or that? Or I got that? How much would that cost? And was that you're always being rationed. The free market is a rationing of its own. The ration card is a democratic rationing. It's a leveling rationing. It says the guy with the Mercedes and this campesino both are going to get a certain amount of powdered milk, a certain amount of beans, some sugar, some other foods, some canned foods, whatever else. His kids get a pair of shoes every year so they don't get hookworm. That's something he never had before. And that's why he supports that revolution. And he fights for that ration card. And that revolution, for all its mistakes and all its crimes, and may even commit crimes at times when it's being attacked on 2 fronts, who says it's infallible. And for all its long lines and waiting and everything else, for all the struggle, he supports and he stays with that revolution because that's all he's got. Because the idea of going back to slavery, the idea of going back when he couldn't read, the idea of going back to hear his kids crying of hunger again is something he will not do. He prefers to fight and struggle for that. That's what it's about. And the media would never tell you that story, and they would never allow me on the media to tell you that story. We have freedom of speech as long as we're in small rooms like this. But the democratic forces of this society have not penetrated corporate power. And as long as we don't penetrate and we haven't been able to challenge and break into that corporate power which controls and preempts the audiences of 20 and 30 and 40 million, that corporate power will give you George Will, snotty little preppy, William Buckley, snotty little ruling elitist, McLaughlin, that right-wing boor, Evans and Novak, 2 more right-wing boors, and you can go on. And your opinion is from the far right over to a kind of a pale, wishy-washy, simpy, centrist view.
What we hear also is that there's another pernicious element, and the thing we have to stop in these countries is a thing called communism, and that there are communists in these countries. It's time, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, it's time we ask, what's a communist? What does a communist do that is so dangerous. They would have us believe that communists merely hunger for power rather than wanting the power to end hunger. They would have us believe, well, the New York Times, let me refer to an editorial where they describe the undesirable and offensive Managua regime. By the way, these countries don't have governments, they have regimes. You'll see that in newspapers all the time. We have government. And I said to myself, what is undesirable and offensive about Managua? Is it the land reform program, where they took all that massive land owned by those few rich compradors and gave it out to the people who were starved for land? Is it the farm co-ops that they're setting up? Is it the community industries and the public work programs to create jobs for people who have been chronically unemployed? Is it the food program, a ration of beans and rice for every kid in Nicaragua so that nobody, no matter how poor that country is, they're all getting fed? Is it having the lowest infant mortality rate in Central America despite earthquake and civil war and foreign invasion and attack and embargo? Lower even than Costa Rica, which is supposed to be the big show place? What's so offensive about Managua? It is those things in some degree. It is creating a competing social order. It is people, it is those who have been downtrodden. It has been those who have been used as fodder in the capital accumulation process, now claiming back the process of production, claiming back their own land, claiming back their own flag, their own dignity, and saying this country is going to be for us and not for you anymore, gringo. And that's the communist program, and that's what communists are. I had somebody up in Vermont say, she got up, and she was one of those trust funders who works on peace a lot, and she said, oh, sorry there. She said, people are saying that the Salvadoran guerrillas are communists, but they're not communists. They're just ordinary peasants. So why are we fighting them? The implication being that if they were communists, it would be okay to go in and pulverize them. And I pointed out that, well, look, at least in the FLM and the Front, there's at least 2 of those 5 groups. At least 2. I'm not sure about all of it. But at least 2 of them that would not deny the label communist. They would say, yo soy comunista. You know, they'd say it. And they would say it proudly. And what does it mean to be a communist? It means to fight and devote yourself to the people. If communists, if we leftists, if we Marxists, if we revolutionaries, if we progressives, if we all we want is to hunger for power, then why do we side with the powerless? Then why don't we toady up to power? Why don't we take the road of the Henry Kissingers and the Daniel Patrick Moynahans and the Ziggy Brzezinskis and the Eugene Rostows and the McGeorge Bundys, who toady up and mouth for power? When Henry Kissinger was made National Security Advisor for Richard Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller gave him $50,000 as a going-away present. As Nelson Rockefeller testified himself before the Senate committee when he was being appointed Vice President of the United States. And they asked, and the senators, well, they really went at Rockefeller really hard. They said, why'd you do that, Mr. Rockefeller? And Rockefeller said, well, giving's always been a tradition in our family. Giving. They cast their bread upon the waters and more came back, didn't it? He was saying to Henry Kissinger, Henry, I brought you out of Harvard. I brought you out of that Center for, or whatever that was, Strategic Studies, because I liked the books you were writing and you were writing them for me. Henry, you remember you're going to go work for Tricky Dick, but you remember who you belong to. And that's what hungering for power is. It's climbing like the political climbers and careers have done in every country in the world. And we on the left don't do that. We stand out in the rain. We stand out on the picket lines. We put our jobs on the line. We risk our careers. In many cases, we even risk our physical safety and our lives in all sorts of countries. If it's power we want, why do we take such a circuitous route? If it's power Senator Garland wants, why is he standing back there? In 70 years, standing like a legion. Well, these communists do all these reform things, yes. And liberal columnist Richard Cohen in the Washington Post says, and I think I've heard it about 800 times from different people, we ought to copy what the communists do. Why are we always on the wrong side? Why do we go into these countries and find ourselves on the side of the big landowners, the sweatshop owners, the big corrupt generals who run little prostitution rackets on the side and all that stuff? Then why are we with that element? Why don't we capture the hearts and minds of the people the way the communists do? Why don't we copy their techniques? What are their techniques? Well, communist techniques are very well known. Just the things we just said. They go into the village. They do land reform. They try to bring clean drinking water. They pay for the food they take. They try to help the people organize themselves. That's what they do. But if we did those things, we not only would have stolen their program, we would have become them. Because that's what they were doing. That's the thing we're fighting to prevent. That's what our government and our ruling class is fighting to prevent. That's why we always go in on the wrong side, because the wrong side is the right side for the class interests of this administration and every other administration that's occupied the White House. So it is the heart of U.S. policy, ladies and gentlemen, to use fascism to preserve capitalism while claiming to be saving democracy from communism.
The surest way to gain wealth in a capitalist society is to have the foresight, the resourcefulness, and the intelligence and creativity to pick the right parents at birth. That really is the best way. There's very little really transporting from one class to another. I mean, you might go, my father was a blue-collar Italian-American worker in New York, and I was a street kid in New York City, and I didn't go to college after high school, not for a while. I worked and all that. Okay, so I was lucky because I was at a certain stage where the economy was expanding, universities were expanding, there was a stipend, a fellowship. I don't see that, though. I don't see that I don't see it as a manifestation of the beneficence of capitalism, one. I don't see it as a demonstration of the individual greatness and accomplishment of this present person. I'm a self-made man. That's baloney. There's no such thing as a self-made man. I wouldn't have been able to go anywhere if it wasn't for generations of people whose names I don't even know, who fought for the principle of public education. That's how I went to school, because I got public education. And that was true. I went to City College of New York. And even when I went to Yale for my PhD, it was on stipends and fellowships, because there were people who fought for having stipends and fellowships for needy students. Those are all socialist principles. Those are all socialist reasons. So rather than saying, yeah, my pop was poor and all, and look at me today, unemployed academic, eh? I call myself a recovering academic. I've been kicked out of some of the best universities in America for my political activities.
What we have to understand is that identity politics can go just so far that even if you think that your greatest calling and mission and feeling in life is to realize the full experience of yourself as a Chicano lesbian or whatever you are, you also have to remember that you're a working person, that you're breathing the same polluted air, that you're getting taxed up the kazoo, that you are being exploited, that you may not have a job, that you have to pay rent. You also have all those other issues and all the different identity groups that have been working so hard during the 80s and 70s to distinguish themselves, to develop their own autonomy, to separate themselves from everybody else, have to realize that they all have a common enemy, that they're going to do it to all of you. When they come, they will round up the gays, and they will round up the African Americans and the Chicanos, and they will round up, they will even round up a lot of angry white males like me and others in this audience. And what we have to realize is that all these issues, many of these issues are interlinked. That is not to reduce. There are particular issues that have particular grievances and particular histories and agendas.
women's issues, gay issues, African-American issues. They all have that. And I'm not trying to reduce that to class struggle, but they all are linked in some way to class struggle, and they all face a common enemy. It is time for unity. It is time for people to start emphasizing the things that bring them together and not emphasizing the few things that might separate them. So a student of mine said, you know, I can't believe that. I can't believe that the President of the United States, that President Bush would misrepresent and mislead us into a war because he disapproved of what some other leader was doing in his own country. I can't believe that they would use power like that. I mean, he was a sweet, nice kid, you know. And he said, that's the difference between you and me. I have faith in the president. I said, wait a minute. Faith? Is that the word you... I mean, what are we doing here? Politics or religion? What is this? What do you mean you have faith? You mean the way my Italian grandma had faith in St. Anthony? She used to have a little statue with lights. Oh, bella, Georgie Bush, oh, bella, Georgie Bush. He said, well, I trust the president. I trust him. I said, trust? That's another word. What do you mean you trust? We don't trust. Democracy isn't about trust. People didn't give their lives to build up trust, to try to live on trust. Democracy is about distrust. Democracy is about the people mobilizing and challenging and calling for transparency, for investigation, for showing what this is about. No, trust is a blind faith. No, you know, trust is something you reserve for your loved ones or close friends, and even them, check them out once in a while.
We need a strong alternative movement to move both against the Republicrats and Democrats, and not just locally, but nationally and internationally. We need more militancy and resistance. What can we do about it? If that's going to be the question, I'm going to answer it right now, so don't ask it. There are no easy answers. What are you willing to do? We can all do a little more, a lot more than we are now doing. Just look at the tables around the hall and sign up and get active. And finally, remember this, that history, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, history never ends. The last page is never written. History is always being rewritten, and its best passages are not written by the princes or the presidents or the prime ministers or the popes. The best passages are written by the people. For all their faults, the people are all we have. In fact, we are they. Thank you.